Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is David Farnsworth. I'm an associate here at RAP, and today we're going to be talking about the changing nature of the investment challenge in a low-carbon power market, how different approaches to addressing concerns about reliability can dramatically affect the cost of reliability, the essential role of consumers in this process, how energy market prices can drive the best innovative solutions, and ways to think about how the intersection between low carbon investment and competitive markets may evolve. We're fortunate to have RAP Senior Advisor Mike Hogan to walk you through this topic. Splitting his time between RAP's US and EU teams, Mike works on issues related to power market design, integration of low carbon supply, system planning, and demand response. In a previous life, Mike directed programs for the European Climate Foundation, promoting the full decarbonization of the European power supply. And prior to that, he had a long career in power project development, internationally with firms like General Electric's Power Systems, J. Makowski, Intergen, and Direct Energy. Mike has also earned degrees in business administration, planning, aerospace engineering, and philosophy. Before I hand off to Mike, let me explain briefly how this webinar will work. First, we have about a half-hour presentation. Then Mike will answer questions until about 5 minutes to the hour, and then wrap up with some final thoughts. With that, at the top of the hour, we will end our 60-minute session. But if there's interest, Mike will continue to answer your questions for an additional 30 minutes. Since there are so many of you, we prefer to hold the questions until Mike has completed his presentation. The exception, of course, would be if there are one or two burning, clarifying questions. If there are, please type them in, and we will do our best to see that Mike addresses them as he moves through his slides. This presentation is going to be recorded, so we can put it on our website, and you and others can access it at a later time. Finally, we ask you to take just a minute or so after the webinar to fill out our survey. Just a couple questions, but very important ones. Getting your thoughts will help us be more responsive to you in the future. With that, Mike, take it away.
Thanks, David, and good afternoon. The focus of today's presentation, as David indicated, is going to be around the topic of a paper that we just recently published called Hitting the Mark on Missing Money, How to Ensure Reliability at Least Cost to Consumers. The topic is concerning the issues of how markets drive investment, the investment needed in capacity resources that are needed to meet the established standards for reliability, reliable service, and what is called resource adequacy on power systems. In other words, an adequate quantity and quality of resources needed to satisfy the demand for reliable electricity supply. The topic is a rich one, and one that is the subject of an awful lot of discussion, as many of you know. Okay, I'm not sure exactly where you lost me, but anyway, as I was saying, what I'm not planning to discuss today, although we can certainly address it in questions if somebody wishes to, are the standards themselves for reliability and resource adequacy and how performance against them is assessed and enforced. That's a rich topic in and of itself, and we've tackled those questions in some other recent papers, for instance on the regionalization of resource adequacy assessments, and also on best practices in market monitoring, reporting, and enforcement in order to enforce competition in the market. But today's presentation will take the established standards as given. Next slide, please, Deb. So it's difficult to have a very robust discussion about this topic of how markets drive investment and how markets drive the right kind of investment in order to ensure reliability at the least cost to consumers without a good working or basic understanding of how the current energy market is actually designed, and a critical understanding of what we mean when we talk about the missing money problem, which many people like to talk about, and most of you, I'm sure, have heard about. This graph is a conceptual presentation of the way that many current wholesale energy markets are functioning. Certainly not all, but many, and many of the ones, particularly the ones that are often portrayed when people talk about the missing money problem. So what we see here is a supply and demand curve, a classic supply and demand curve, with the market clearing at the equilibrium point. So the P1 of 80 euros a megawatt hour. And what we see in this case is that the demand curve represents only the demand for energy. There is no demand captured here for the reserves and other ancillary services or balancing market services that are required on a minute by minute, hour by hour, daily basis by system operators in order to meet the demand for both energy and reliability. We also see that the supply curve is quite stunted, and that there is a range of actions, marginal actions required, both in the market and by the system operator themselves, in order to, quote, keep the lights on, unquote, particularly during periods when the supply and demand is tight in the market. And finally, of course, as many of you will be aware, prices are capped overall at a level that is typically a very small fraction of what policymakers and regulators say repeatedly is the average value of continuous service to consumers. So typically in the 1,000 to 3,000 euro megawatt hour range, whereas the value of continuous service that is built into resource adequacy standards is typically in the range of 10 to 15 to 20 and some, even as high as 30,000 euros per megawatt hour. So this is the rather distorted version that is often portrayed or in people's minds when they think about energy price formation and energy and balancing markets. Next slide, please. In fact, if we want to talk about marginal cost pricing, it's worth taking a look at what the actual marginal costs are, especially under system stress events, in order for the lights to stay on. And these actions are taken by a range of players, but of course under system stress events, quite often they are actions that are triggered by the system operator, acting in effect as the supplier, as the buyer and seller of last resort in the market. And that is based on really a feature of the nature of electricity systems, the physics of electricity systems, and it's unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. The role of system operators effectively operating as buyer and seller of last resort is going to be a feature of the electricity system for some time to come. And the actual marginal costs, including the opportunity costs of various actions, are portrayed here. And this is a representative listing of costs on a typical system. Every system is going to be a little bit different. But as you can see, the range of marginal costs in order to keep the lights on is quite large and is considerably higher in many cases than either the price cap or the prices that are allowed to form in many energy and balancing markets. Next slide, please. So what we end up, if we capture, as the energy market is designed to do, if we capture both the actual marginal costs, and keeping in mind that, as is often stated correctly, that the energy market is meant to form prices based on the marginal cost of power. So if we capture the actual marginal costs from 1 hour to the next in order to keep the lights on, And we capture that at a clearing price that is based on the total demand in the market for energy and reserves, and that demand coming from both from consumers themselves and from the system operator acting as the buyer and seller of last resort. We see that under the same set of circumstances, under a tight but not emergency tight, just a sort of an average peak demand period on a power system, that under those circumstances, the clearing price in reality could be as high as 2,000 euros a megawatt hour, not 80 euros a megawatt hour. Next slide, please. One of the consequences of doing that, of course, is that it exposes or makes visible the value that can be had from consumers actually acting on the actual value of continuous service for actual consumers across a wide range of actual energy services. And the benefits of that, of course, can be that rather than incurring the actual cost, which is a real cost, whether it's captured in prices or not, rather than incurring an actual cost in order to keep the lights on of 2,000 euros a megawatt hour, as price responsive demand is given the opportunity to and acquires the ability to respond to market conditions, that under the same set of circumstances, the market may actually clear considerably lower than that, at say 800 euros a megawatt hour, but considerably above the distorted view of marginal cost pricing under the first slide of 80 euros a megawatt hour. So when we talk about energy, quote, energy only markets, unquote, and marginal cost pricing and missing money, we need to keep in mind that money missing from energy only markets is not missing by design. It's missing because of a range of various ways that system operators and market participants fail to capture the full demand for energy and balancing services and fail to reflect the true marginal cost of keeping the lights on under all circumstances in all hours. And by operating the market in ways that suppress the true marginal cost price in an energy-only market, we suppress innovation and investment in consumer empowerment. And we end up overpaying for the standard of reliability that we have collectively accepted or agreed we wish to impose. Next slide, please. This is a good point for any clarifying questions, if there are any. Otherwise, we can move on.
There are no clarifying questions, Mike. Please continue.
Apparently, I'm being incredibly clear. Either that or everybody left when I lost my connection. Before we move into the question of how to address legitimate concerns about money that's actually missing in practice from markets for the remuneration of the capacity needed to meet established standards of reliability, it's worth keeping in mind that there are lots of circumstances where there are claims of missing money when in fact the primary problem is something quite different. It's often claimed that low prices in many markets in Europe and in North America today are evidence that the markets can't work with the growing share of renewables on the system and other low marginal cost marginal cost resources, and that this is a missing money problem that needs to be fixed with some other form of market design. The reality is, in many of these markets, that the explanation for low prices, low wholesale prices, is really quite straightforward. there's a massive amount of surplus capacity in many of these markets. And what you see on the top is is data from the European market based on the most recent system outlook and adequacy forecast from NSOE that shows supply of capacity versus peak demand for 2016, and then forecast for 2020 and 2025. And at the bottom is the same data where we have discounted the installed capacity of wind to 20% of its nameplate capacity, and we have discounted the installed capacity of solar to 0 in order to take a look at the same data and address concerns that people quite, reasonably express about how much of the installed intermittent capacity can be relied upon to meet peak demand. Those are overly conservative discount factors, but they nonetheless demonstrate that in Europe, and you would see much the same situation in most of North America, that there is currently a large surplus of installed capacity, and that surplus at the moment is not forecast to go away anytime in the foreseeable future. That's the most obvious explanation for low prices. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but the bottom line is that no market, however constituted, can be expected to drive new investment when in fact there is no new investment in capacity needed to meet what the market is attempting to deliver, which is reliable electricity supply at a reasonable cost. So we need to be careful when we talk about missing money to make sure that what we're talking about is actually money missing from the market, rather than simply a structural surplus of supply that needs to be dealt with one way or the other. Next slide, please. So, accepting nonetheless that there can be, and in many cases is, money missing from markets because for the money missing from the remuneration of capacity actually needed to meet the established security supply standard because of various problems with the way the markets are implemented and operated. It is worth asking what the best way is to address that problem. In other words, what I'm saying is we are not disputing the fact that there may be money missing from markets, many markets under the current situation, and that problem is likely to persist for some time. The question really becomes how to fix it, and how to fix it in such a way that the obligation to deliver reliability to consumers at the lowest reasonable cost is respected. And the reason that it matters how we address that problem is that how much is needed very much depends on what kind. And the difference in the way in the different measures we adopt to top up the amount of remuneration that is being provided to investors in capacity really comes down to one word, and that's flexibility. Study after study has confirmed what power system engineers have understood for decades, which is that when it comes to the cost of ensuring reliability, all capacity is not created equal. That's always been true, but the effect will become especially dramatic as we move further down the road to a decarbonized power sector. This graph shows the results from one such recent study, the IEA's The Power of Transformation. And while it's a pretty rich slide and we could spend a lot of time on it, the bottom line from this slide is that we're looking at a system, and both the top and the bottom portray a system with the same amount of demand, the same shape of demand, the same penetration of variable resources on an annual basis, the amount of energy produced. But in the two cases, the difference being that in the first case, that system has maintained its legacy mix of conventional resources with a significant share of base load, some mid-merit or intermediate resources, and then a small slice of peaking. And in the bottom, that's under those same circumstances, the mix of conventional resources has transitioned from a base load heavy mix of resources to one that has a much larger share of mid-merit resources, a smaller share of base load, and still a small slice of peaking resources. And what you see on the right is the dramatic difference in the utilization of each category of resources. On the top, the base load is being utilized at a very low capacity utilization rate for base load resources, basically an financially unsustainable rate. Whereas in the bottom case, the smaller share of base load is being operated as base load. Mid-merit in the top case is also being utilized at a very, very low utilization rate, whereas at the bottom it is low but in the range of what a mid-merit generator is typically expects to see in the market, and then peak in both cases is peak. The point being that in both cases we're trying to meet the same reliability standard, are meeting the same reliability standard. In both cases we have the same demand, same shape of demand, same amount of demand, and in both cases a large share, the same large share of intermittent resources on the system. But in the top case, we have a very high cost, economically unsustainable situation, which, to be frank, is perhaps the situation that most closely characterizes much of the European and North American market today. And in the bottom, same reliability standard, same demand, but a much more economically or financially stable and sustainable circumstance. And the difference in capital investment required to meet the reliability standard between the top and the bottom can be as much as 40%. So how much? Very much depends on what kind, and that has always been the case, but as we grow the share of zero carbon resources on the system, unavoidably that fact is going to become much more dramatic. Next slide, please. So if it matters this much how we address the issue of missing money and how we address the issue of needing to top up the remuneration in markets for the resources needed to meet the established standard of reliability, how do markets do that? Well, what you see here is average weekly wholesale energy prices in 6 different markets. On the left are 3 markets where whatever measures have been taken in order to address this problem have focused on prices in the energy and balancing services markets. On the right, you see 3 markets where the principal focus for addressing issues of missing money has been on setting up a parallel market for a discrete commodity that is referred to as capacity. And so the fixing of money missing from energy and balancing services markets in the 3 markets on the right has been focused outside of those markets through a parallel capacity mechanism. And the difference between the markets on the left and the markets on the right can very legitimately be termed the value of flexibility, and the way that energy markets, the way that competitive wholesale markets actually express the value of flexibility. And if we go to the next slide, it's also worth considering that while there are not a lot of really good, robust studies or definitive studies that have looked into this question, the available data, at least the available data that I've been able to identify, the 3 markets in the red circle are 3 of the markets from the previous slide. ERCOT, which is one of the markets that addresses this problem through the energy and balancing services markets themselves predominantly. the other two, PJM and ISO New England, are markets that have adopted parallel separate capacity markets. And while there are a lot of factors that go into the average annual wholesale prices across these markets, the fact of the matter is that higher short-term price volatility does not necessarily translate into higher average prices, and in fact there is evidence that it leads to lower overall average prices because of the more efficient valuation of the need for the value of flexibility, the value of flexible resources in these markets. Next slide, please. Part of this a really critical part of this as we go further towards a fully decarbonized power sector, really gets to the issue of whether consumers will be able to participate in the market in the way that consumers participate in all commodity markets, in the sense that they have the opportunity to and can benefit from responding to the conditions in the supply and demand of the commodity, and how they respond. And as you can see here, this is from the Roadmap 2050 project, and it shows a typical summer week on a system with a lot of wind and a lot of solar. And the purple line at the top is a typical gross demand profile, historical demand of the way that consumers traditionally consumed electricity in a summer week. And as you can see, under that circumstance, there would be many hours where there's a lot of energy thrown away, and other hours when the supply of energy would be inadequate. But certainly over the course of the day, the amount of energy available on an aggregate basis is sufficient or more than sufficient to meet the overall demand. And the demand response that is going to be valuable under these circumstances is not simply reducing demand at peak periods. It's demand that can vary up and down in response to wholesale conditions, can do so on a daily basis if there's value in doing so. May even be demand that can do so more than once a day if there's value in doing so. And this is not science fiction. This is very, very realistic, based on the actually well-established technology that's available today, both in ICT, information and communication technology, and using very conventional energy storage technologies such as grid-integrated electric water heaters, storage, ice storage, refrigeration and air conditioning, and a number of other end-use energy storage options. And this simply assumes that only about 10% of the demand in the course of a day is able to shift from one hour to another hour in that day. And in a system, let's say this is looking at 2030, in a system where there's been a significant amount of electrification of heat and transport, that's actually quite a conservative estimate. And the question is, how are markets going to drive this kind of innovation on the demand side? Both the innovation in the services and products that are available to consumers, and investment in the end-use technologies and systems that will make it convenient for consumers to do this, easy for them to do it, and beneficial to them financially to do it. And it is, if we continue to suppress or remove the short-term price signals that come from a fully and robustly priced energy and balancing services market, we will essentially be trying to drive a mountain road with the windscreen covered, and trying to understand what the best way is to navigate those conditions without the information needed and without the innovation that will be beneficial to get through that process at a reasonable cost. So how do we look at how do we address the missing money problem? What are the options available to address the missing money problem in ways that do not undermine the market's ability to value flexibility and innovation? Next slide, please. Well, one of the most well-established and so far quite successful ways to do that as an alternative to setting up parallel mechanisms that extract money or prevent money from being restored in the energy and balancing services markets is what some people refer to as an operating reserve demand curve or administrative reserve shortage pricing curve, which basically looks on an hour-by-hour basis or dispatch interval by dispatch interval basis at the combined demand for energy and balancing services, and to the extent that the supply available ends up being short of what is needed in order to meet both the demand for energy and the demand for reserves and other services. It assesses whether the market is pricing energy at a price that reflects the administratively set value of continuous service, and if it's not, it adjusts those prices appropriately. And what we end up seeing, next slide please, in a market where this has been applied is in fact a considerable improvement. And this is looking at the ERCOT market in Texas, where this is the principal measure that has been adopted to address the missing money problem. There is no parallel capacity market per se in the ERCOT market. What we're seeing here is the application of an alternative to a parallel capacity market, one that focuses on improving the price signals from the energy and balancing services markets, and in a market that was in fact seeing concerns about the level of investment needed to meet the established reserve margin, and the reserve margin, the target reserve margin in the ERCOT market is entirely consistent with the reserve margins applied, target reserve margins applied in PJM and ISO New England, and is in fact even more stringent than the established reserve margin applied currently in many of the European markets. It's more stringent than the UK's reliability standard. It's more stringent than the French reliability standard. And following the implementation of this alternative approach to addressing missing money, the situation has improved dramatically in the ERCOT market with significant investment, and they are actually currently forecasting a small surplus over and above the target reserve margin in that market. Next slide, please. This is just a depiction of actually dispatch intervals in the ERCOT market during which the administrative adjustments were applied in order to make sure that the energy market prices were reflecting the value of energy and reliability in the market. The blue dots were during a relatively mild year in that region, and the red dots that was 2014, and then the red dots were 2015, which was a more typical weather year in that region. And what you see is quite a large number of dispatch intervals during which prices reflected a shortage of energy and reserves, which is to be expected in a market with a healthy balance between supply and demand. And rather than the typical portrayal of either very, very low prices or sudden and unexpected eruptions of very, very high prices, in fact, what you see is more of a continuum of many hours during which shortages begin to appear at relatively modest levels, and price signals set and projected hours in advance which in fact allow resources that are capable of doing so to respond at prices well below the $9,000 a megawatt hour cap in those markets, in that market. And as I said, at least so far, a healthy and required level of investment. Next slide, please. If we look at data that is available from a wide range of markets in both North America and in this case in Australia, from markets where we're able to compare performance in markets with and without parallel capacity mechanisms, out-of-market capacity mechanisms, what we see on the left, well, the green, these are markets ordered from top to bottom in ascending order of how invasive or interventionist the capacity mechanism is, from ERCOT, which has essentially no parallel capacity market, through three other markets, New York ISO, PJM, and ISO New England, where the interventions become more and more extreme. And in Australia, we have the NEM, where, again, with essentially no capacity mechanism, and then the Southwest Interconnected System that has a PJM-style or ISO New England-style capacity mechanism. And so what we see is actually no consistent pattern of the effectiveness of these mechanisms in driving the amount of investment needed in order to meet the demand for reliability. The blue bars show the average annual new build as a percentage of the 2014 peak demand in each of these markets during the period, and these tend to be about 10 to 15 years of data, during the period during which the various market designs have been in place. On the right, the red bars indicate the 2015 firm capacity available in these markets relative to the target amount of firm capacity needed in order to meet the reliability standard. And what we see, while we don't see a consistent pattern of effectiveness in, or relative effectiveness in driving new investment, what we do see is a consistent pattern of over procurement as the as the intensity of the effect of the parallel capacity markets increases, and so it is the available data would suggest that there's no clear pattern that the conventional capacity markets are more successful at fixing the missing money problem than measures focused on improving price formation in the energy and balance service markets. And in fact, there is data to suggest, and there are a number of analysts who have come to the same conclusion, data to suggest that these parallel mechanisms have the effect of driving up costs and driving down the efficiency of the markets. If there are no clarifying questions, I'll move to parting thoughts. So just to conclude, as we talked about earlier, money is not missing by design from markets. It's missing because of the various ways, both intentional and unintentional, that market operators fail to account for all demand and all marginal costs. Second point, effective energy and balancing markets are essential to valuing investments in flexibility and spurring innovation. Administrative measures should target them rather than simply paying for capacity. There are markets that add capacity a separate capacity mechanism as a belts and braces measure in addition to or underneath efforts, sustained efforts and targeted efforts to improve price formation in the energy and balancing markets. And while that still introduces inefficiencies and adds costs to consumers that are not necessarily value for money, they can be beneficial politically in addressing concerns of policymakers that they'd rather not be entirely reliant on the effective functioning of the wholesale commodities markets. That's a possible, that's a politically possible, feasible approach. But again, the primary focus needs to be on making sure that if you're going to have a market, it needs to be an effective energy and balancing market, and it can be an effective energy and balancing market, including administrative measures to target the pricing in those markets to make sure that it is reflecting not only competition but also the actual value of continuous service to consumers as expressed in the publicly established reliability standards. And finally, policy support for renewables deployment is not only compatible with a well-functioning market, and that's not just us saying that. You can ask the organizations that operate the trading markets themselves, EEX and EPEX, but they are actually key to integrating variable renewables reliably at least cost to consumers. So with that, we can go to any final questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. That's a terrific job, despite the question of how robust telecommunications is in the state of New Hampshire today. Great work. Let's jump to some questions. Back on with regard to slides 5 through 8. There's a question as to what is the quantity cleared in each. The observation is presumably more quantity cleared in the first two graphs, indicating that consumers are paying not just more per megawatt hour, but more for total energy.
So we're talking about slides 5 through 8.
Yeah, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Didn't see the quantity cleared in each. Presumably, more quantity cleared in the first two graphs, indicating that consumers are paying not just more per megawatt hour, but more for total energy. Correct?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. The quantity cleared, the quantity of energy that clears in the market in all three graphs is exactly the same. And in fact, the quantity of reserves demanded by the system operator in order for the system operator to fulfill their obligations of meeting the secure supply standard, the quantity of reserves demanded in each case in slide 5 and slide 7 is also the same. The difference is that that in slide 7 we're showing the market clearing at a price that reflects the demand for both, whereas in slide 5 the market is clearing based on the demand only for energy, which of course is an artificial clearing price because it does not reflect the total demand on system resources during that period. So the amount of energy cleared in both cases is the same. In slide 8, which is where we depict the extent to which demand has an opportunity now, based on the proper operation of the energy and balancing markets in slide 7, where demand has both the opportunity and the incentive to actually respond to the conditions in the wholesale market and presumably in the retail market, that the total amount of energy and the total amount of energy and the total amount of reserves does actually clear at a lower quantity. So the quantity is reduced. The quantity of demand is reduced by demand having better information about what the value of doing so would be during that period. So in slide 8, the quantity is reduced, but it's reduced because the cost of supply and the total amount of demand for energy reserves are actually reflected in the the setting of prices in the wholesale market. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks, Mike. How can a carbon price be overlaid into the energy-only market structure in a manner that incentivizes renewable build-out and innovation?
Well, there are two parts to that question. One is the way that a carbon price overlays on this is pretty straightforward. The costs reflected in the supply curve, the blue curve, will simply be adjusted upwards to the extent that that the carbon content of the various supply options ends up being priced. So whether the carbon price is 5 euros or 15 euros or 50 euros a ton, will simply be will adjust the costs on the supply curve upwards. Whether that the more interesting question is whether simply relying on a carbon price to adjust the price of carbon-intensive supply upwards will, in and of itself, drive renewables build-out. And that's where we get back into this issue of a fully saturated or oversaturated market for capacity. A market that doesn't need new investment in resources to keep the lights on is not going to drive, in and of itself, new investment in zero-carbon resources at any carbon price level. All it's going to do is drive up the costs of the existing carbon-intensive resources and drive off, to the extent that they're surplus to requirements, drive off the higher carbon resources in favor of lower carbon resources. But waiting on in a market that is saturated or oversaturated with capacity resources needed to keep the lights on, you really need three things to be in place in order for carbon pricing to drive the targeted build-out of new zero-carbon resources. One is you would need the carbon price to be high enough to make sure that zero-carbon resources, when they're needed, are cheaper than carbon-intensive resources. And arguably, in most cases, we don't need any carbon price to do that today. Onshore wind is, in many cases, already cheaper than gas or coal, or certainly oil. In some cases, solar is even cheaper in certain very solar-rich regions than gas and coal. But in any case, to get to the levels of build-out that we're looking at, that various government public authorities have targeted, you would need to have a substantial carbon price. And at the moment, whether in the carbon markets in Europe or the emerging carbon markets, the RGGI market or the California market in the US, there is no current prospect for prices to be anywhere near the level needed to achieve that level of build-out. The second thing you would need is you would need there to be a demand in the market for new capacity resources in order to meet the established reliability standard. And of course, as we've seen both in Europe and in most of North America, that demand simply isn't there. There is a current surplus of resources, and that surplus is forecasted at the moment to extend years into the future unless and until we get to grips with the idea that as we add a megawatt of new firm capacity, we need to be making sure that a megawatt of old and now surplus to requirements firm capacity leaves the market. And in the face of efforts by various governments to protect the financial viability of existing legacy resources, that's going to require some proactive policy. The third thing you would need is you would need, even if there was demand, for incremental demand for new investment to keep the lights on, you would need the 60 or 70 years that would be required to rely simply on natural attrition to turn over the existing resource base from what the legacy of inflexible high carbon resources to a largely zero carbon flexible resource base, and we don't have 60 to 70 years. So it's, carbon, it is a good thing on its face to try to price the externality that we call carbon and that is certainly something we should be doing. But the idea that we can rely on carbon pricing in developed power systems such as Europe and North America and Australia to drive the level of build-out in new renewables needed to meet the targets is just not a realistic proposition.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to stop you there. We've reached the top of the hour. Once again, I'd like to thank you for the terrific presentation, for your persistence, for the listeners' persistence. Everyone, I'd like to remind you to watch your email. We'll be sending links to the recording of this webinar along with the slide deck to all of you who registered. And with that, I'd like to formally end our 60-minute presentation. As I mentioned earlier on, please stay on the line and Mike will answer questions for another 30 minutes. And here we go, Mike.
Okay.
Question, before you cut out on slide 13, you were making a point on the value of flexibility. You said that there were not any studies on the issue of ... Can you repeat that point, please?
I'm not aware of it. Well, there have been a lot of attempts over the years to try to isolate the cost impact to consumers of markets that have adopted parallel capacity markets to address the missing money problem versus markets that try to fix the problem by focusing on improving the price signals from the energy and balancing services markets. I'm not aware of any that have come to really sort of widely accepted, clear conclusions. Most of these analyses have been done by people who are pursuing, an agenda, and they reflect that. But just looking at the raw data that's available from some of these markets, and without trying or putting forth a lot of effort to isolate, do regression analyses or whatever, to isolate the specific impact of capacity, parallel out-of-market capacity mechanisms versus no parallel out-of-market capacity mechanisms. The raw data would suggest that accepting the possibility of higher short-term wholesale market prices and more short-term price volatility in the wholesale markets as a way of supporting or driving support for investment in the needed resources does not lead to higher average wholesale prices, and may in fact lead to a lower average annual wholesale prices. This graph doesn't show the average annual wholesale prices in the two Australian markets, but that data also tends to support this conclusion. Average annual wholesale prices in the NEM market tend to be materially lower than average annual wholesale prices in the Southwest Interconnected System. And again, I'm not saying that that's definitive. There are a number of factors that go into what the average annual wholesale prices are in each of these markets. But the data simply does not support the conclusion, that accepting the possibility of higher short-term prices and higher short-term price volatility leads to higher wholesale prices. And people often then jump to the claim that even if you accept more the possibility of higher short-term prices and higher short-term price volatility, that leaves you with a difficult investment environment of investors having to rely on being able to capture occasional very high short-term prices, and that relying simply on capturing those prices in the wholesale market is not a feasible investment strategy. And I guess the 2 points to make about that are, one, as we saw in the price data from the ERCOT market, the emergence of shortage pricing in those markets, certainly absolutely assisted by administrative measures, is not one where the availability of shortage pricing is extremely rare and very difficult to rely upon, but in fact is a much more common occurrence than is commonly understood, and can emerge across a whole range of price signals. But secondly, and more importantly, and again, this has been established in market after market after market where this has been implemented. The design assumption for how investment is going to take place efficiently in these markets is not that investors are simply going to sit back and rely on capturing spot prices in the wholesale market. As someone who used to invest in these markets, invested well over $8 billion worth of capital in power projects in different markets, I can tell you that the investment strategy relies on a portfolio of revenue models, some of which certainly, some small percentage of which can rely on, can be based on what you consider like a true merchant, where you are relying on capturing wholesale spot prices, but a much larger percentage of it will rely on wholesale market participants, suppliers and generators, retail suppliers and generators, responding to legitimate wholesale market price and volume risks by engaging in a wide range of risk management activities, including forward trading of various hedging instruments and bilateral contracts, and that provides the revenue predictability and stability that investors look for and that retail suppliers look for. And that's not just theory. That's the way it has worked in the ERCOT market. It's the way it's worked in the NEM market. And in fact, in markets such as PJM, where there is a parallel capacity mechanism, the efforts over recent years to improve the formation of prices in the wholesale energy and balancing markets has led to increased levels of activity in between wholesale market participants and engaging in activities. And in fact, if you look at the data, that has been the primary driver of the fairly healthy level of investment that's taken place.
A question about one of your earlier slides, Mike, where you set out a list of resources, marginal cost resources. The basic question is, how do you come up with the marginal cost for those resources?
There are a couple of really good studies that you can look at that actually I sort of drew on both of them and merged them to come up with a single list. But these marginal costs reflect a combination of the actual cost of calling on some of these resources, for instance, emergency generation. In many markets, there are options that are available from generators, such as overfiring for short, limited periods of time, that have actual marginal cost. Production cost of can be 500 euros a megawatt hour. It can be higher, it can be lower. And then there are other actions that have opportunity costs in order for system operators and other market participants to release resources to produce energy that in fact have a value and therefore a cost to the system operator, to the system, in order to meet in order for the system operator to meet its obligation to comply with the publicly established security supply standard. And so these costs are a reflection of the combination of those two things. With the highest costs, of course, as you see, emergency load shedding, or disconnections, as is sometimes used, the term used, being reflecting the full, in this case, the established, the price cap, which is meant to be something at or close to the administratively determined value of continuous service to consumers of 9,000 euros a megawatt hour. In fact, the established, what's called value of lost load, or VOL, in many of these markets is considerably higher than that, and one could argue that a cap of even a cap of 9,000 euros a megawatt hour is still not reflecting the full value of continuous service to consumers. But of course, these are practical compromises that are often accepted. And as I suggested in one of the other slides, simply requiring that the cost be set at the average value of lost load, even if it's correct, if it actually is the average, can significantly overstate the cost to most consumers of continuous service for most energy services. So in that sense, there might even be a practical argument for setting the opportunity cost at the highest cost option of emergency load shedding at something below the full average vol. But the point being that these costs are true costs. Any economist will tell you that an opportunity cost is a cost. These costs are the true costs at the margins of a whole range of actions that are required under system stress conditions sequentially in order to keep the lights on.
Thank you, Mike. A related question, why do the CRMs essentially achieve twice as high reserve margins as targeted? Is it because they tender twice as much capacity, or is it existing legacy investments which stay on too long?
Well, a lot of people have tried to answer that question, is why is it that CRMs seem to consistently overprocure, and the more intense the CRM, the more the overprocurement. Part of it is surely because even in systems where the system operator is truly independent and has no equity ownership in any wholesale market assets, they are nonetheless engineers. And as an engineer, I can attest to the fact that engineers are inherently conservative beasts, and given the opportunity to do so, will build contingency margin on top of contingency margin on top of contingency margin. And when you combine that with the fact that when we talk about a CRM being more intense or more intrusive, what we're really talking about is a capacity mechanism that looks further and further into the future. The level of uncertainty grows, and as the level of uncertainty grows, the level of contingency margin built in by engineers tends to grow. So it's a central administrative mechanism that attempts to look far into the future to assess the amount of missing money there's going to be, or put differently, to assess the amount of resources needed relative to the expected amount of resources to be available 3 or 5 or 7 or 8 years into the future. Especially under circumstances where the future is becoming more and more uncertain. It's not surprising to some extent that in soliciting offers of capacity, there's a tendency for system operators to overstate what they need. And if we look at forecast, simply look at one parameter, which is the forecasts for peak demand and average demand, we can look across system after system after system, and there has been a tendency over time, and that tendency has grown as we've focused more and more on improving the efficiency of end use of energy. There's been a tendency to overstate the forecasted demand. And so that's certainly one factor. Another factor, as we mentioned earlier, is that as you continue to try to fix problems with resource adequacy by simply adding capacity and not differentiating capacity, the value of different sources of capacity based on the capabilities that those sources have, you will have a tendency to over-procure capacity because you are procuring the wrong kind of capacity. And we see that in absolutely, it's not even disputed anymore particularly by ISO New England, which has a significant surplus of capacity, and nonetheless is facing issues with reliability on their system because for the better part of a decade they've procured capacity on an undifferentiated basis and have ended up with a significant surplus on paper supply of capacity, but a mix of capacity resources that do not have the capability to respond under certain system stress conditions. And so that has led ISO New England and also PJM, who suffered through the polar vortex along with ISO New England, to substantially reform or revise the design of their capacity markets over the past 2 years in ways that now present investors in capacity resources with much the same, in fact, if you read publications from ISO New England quite deliberately, as effectively exactly the same investment risk and reward profile as they would face under a fully functioning energy and balancing services market. So the long experience in these markets that have experimented with, adopted, operated over a long period of time, parallel out-of-market capacity mechanisms, has been that they just haven't worked that well, and that they won't work that well until they are brought more into line with the way that a fully functioning energy and balancing services market would work, in the way that it drives investment, in the way that it rewards investment, in the way that it presents to investors and to wholesale market participants the risks and rewards of wholesale market pricing.
Thanks, Mike. Do the energy markets with pay-as-bid systems provide better remuneration to units than markets with marginal pricing?
You know, all the data that I've seen over the years and all the analysis that I've seen over the years suggests that pay-as-bid does not work very well. It was an attempt to replicate the sort of cost of service approach where if it costs, resource X 35 euros a megawatt hour on a levelized basis, if that's what they bid, they would get 35, and if it cost resource Y 60 euros a megawatt hour, and that's what they bid, that's what they'd get, which is sort of the way a cost of service system works. But the reality is that you can run a gaming exercise and bidders act the way bidders act, that bid prices converge towards an expectation of what the market clearing price or the marginal resource is going to bid. So on paper or in theory, if you ignore gaming theory, it's a nice idea. The reality is that bidders game the market, not illegally. They bid rationally from a bidder's perspective, and you end up with a somewhat more chaotic set of circumstances that nonetheless converges towards the same result that you get with a single clearing price bidding process.
Okay. Is it problematic to compare average energy prices between ERCOT and the New England ISO, given the price differences for natural gas in the two markets?
Well, as I said at the time, there are a number of things that factor into that, the price differences between those two markets. But just as you can't explain you can't entirely explain the difference in prices simply based on the fact that one over procures capacity because of its out-of-market capacity mechanism, you also cannot explain that price difference entirely. In fact, only a very small amount of that price difference can be explained by the difference in natural gas prices between the two markets. The basis differential between ERCOT and ISO New England is just not large enough to explain the price difference. So there are a number of factors that go into those price differences. I said that at the time, and I'm not claiming that that entire price difference can be explained away by the fact that one has a capacity market and the other one doesn't. What I am saying is that the data that's available does not support the conclusion that because ERCOT has more price volatility and the possibility of higher short-term prices, it is therefore a more expensive market for consumers. In fact, the data that's available would suggest just the opposite.
Given current situation in Australia where there are extensive blackouts occurring, do you think it's possible to tie structural failure of an energy-only market to those problems?
There are not extensive blackouts occurring in the Australian market. There's Australia. The Australian market the NEM is experiencing issues of the issues that are occurring in the Australian market, the NEM market, are primarily associated with transmission and distribution issues, which is virtually always the reason for large-scale service interruptions. But on a resource adequacy basis, if you look at the NEM market in Australia, in terms of the investment in generation and in supply and demand side resources, the Australian market has perfectly adequate, not more than adequate, supply of resources. But the NEM is, as you know, is a system that is widely dispersed, with very heavily reliant on very long transmission connections running between fairly isolated demand centers, and there are probably what issues the NEM is experiencing, and I would not characterize them as widespread blackouts, but there are service issues going on in the NEM that are probably more associated with an inadequate system of locational pricing and a need to invest more in transmission. It certainly on paper has nothing to do with the adequacy of generation and other supply side and demand side generating resources.
Thanks, Mike. I think we have time for you to answer one more question. If I understand this question correctly, can you make some observations about the impact of interconnectors? I think what we're talking about is neighboring systems on system reliability and security.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, it's referred to as interconnectors, which is transmission connections between balancing area authorities. So connections between areas that are balanced by a single central balancing authority. In Europe, that tends to be on a member state by member state basis. So one could say quite justifiably that the boundaries between the balancing area authorities are pretty artificial. They don't actually represent the boundaries between transmission constrained areas. In North America, we tend to refer to those as seams issues between ISO regions, and again, certainly those where those seams are drawn do tend to be artificial. I mean, there's nothing physically important about the boundary between the ISO New England and the New York ISO region. It's a political boundary, but within those regions, the boundaries, the price zones tend to be drawn based on actual physical constraints. But again, so reverting to the question, which is about the interconnections between politically drawn balancing area authorities. There are different ways that balancing area authorities or system operators have tried to address concerns about the ability to rely on interconnectors and on the resources at the other end of the interconnectors to meet demand or the need for reliability and security of supply. It's a long discussion. We actually talk about it to some extent in our paper on the regionalization of resource adequacy, and there are other analyses, reports, studies that have been done. One of the approaches, if you want to look at, for instance, the way PJM handles it, PJM acknowledges both the value to consumers in the PJM market area of being able to access lower cost resources when they're available in order to deal with system stress events, but also acknowledges the difficulty in not having full control even on resources that are in other balancing area authorities and under other political jurisdictions, regardless of how far they can go in setting contract terms to try to enforce their rights to access those resources. And so one way PJM has handled that is that they've sort of drawn a line under the extent to which they try to fix this contractually, although they do have very robust and onerous contractual terms for participation of resources outside of their market area to participate in their markets. But they've acknowledged the limits of addressing the problem that way and have actually set a somewhat arbitrary limit to the amount of the capacity that they accept into their capacity market from out-of-market resources. I think at the moment it's something like 20%, but don't quote me on that. And so it's a combination of things. It's one would be naive to simply assume, to simply expect policymakers and authorities in a given balancing area authority to assume that resources outside of that area are going to be as reliable as resources inside that area. There are various ways to address that problem, but certainly it needs to begin with an independent, objective, statistical analysis of the likelihood that those resources can be relied on, including things such as analyzing the extent to which peak system stress events in one area are going to be occur simultaneously with system stress events in another area. It turns out that statistically is much more unlikely than a lot of people think. And then addressing, the contractual and political issues that can erode the reliability of resources at the other end of the interconnector. But it's also the case that if we've looked at regions in various markets where attempts have been made to overcome that and to take as much advantage of the ability to share resources as possible, that reliability in both regions is almost always improved, and the cost to consumers of achieving that reliability is almost always reduced. And if we look at a great example that's going on right now in the Western Interconnect of North America, where there are something like 38 distinct balancing area authorities across the interconnect. Those authorities have over the years been quite resistant to integrating themselves into a single balancing area authority, and that will sound quite familiar to many European ears. Nonetheless, in recent years, as the share of variable or intermittent resources on the Western Interconnect has grown dramatically, the long-standing economic benefits of integrating into a smaller number of larger balancing area authorities have also increased dramatically. And in the face of what is becoming really an unavoidable economic benefit to their consumers of greater coordination across interconnectors between those balancing area authorities, they are gradually now and very deliberately moving towards what they call an energy imbalance market, which is not a full integration into a single balancing area authority or 2 or 3 balancing area authorities, but is shall we say, two-thirds or 3/4 of the benefit, which is to effectively balance the system across the Western Interconnect as a single system, taking full advantage or close to full advantage of the reliability and cost benefits that can come from optimizing the use of interconnectors. And that's happening now, despite the long-standing parochial political considerations that have prevented balancing area authorities from the Western Interconnect of taking advantage of the opportunities that have been available to them.
Very good. Mike Hogan, thank you so much. This has been a terrific presentation today, and those of you who have joined us online, thank you for your participation and sticking with us despite all the difficulties we had. I hope this has been helpful to you all. Remember, we'll be sending you out a link with a link to a recording of this presentation. And again, if you just take a moment to respond to our 2-question questionnaire, that would be really helpful. Thanks again, Mike, and hope you all have a great day.